Imagine staring at a pristine, perfectly calculated structural blueprint for a skyscraper.
Right, where the math adds up perfectly on paper.
Exactly. The load-bearing walls are clearly marked, and the engineers guarantee the building will hold. But, while you are admiring that piece of paper, the actual building outside your window is simultaneously being hit by a hurricane.
And an earthquake
Yeah.
at the same time.
Yes, and that is exactly what global financial markets are doing right now. I mean, they are trusting the math on the page while just entirely ignoring the shaking walls of the reality we actually live in.
It's a dangerous disconnect.
It really is. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are jumping straight into a really fascinating financial intelligence dispatch today titled The Compound Ledger.
It's a dense one, but incredibly important.
For sure. We're looking at what happens when the world's most sophisticated macroeconomic models get, well, punched in the face by simultaneous real-world crises. But real quick, before we get into the gears of this, a quick note for you, the listener. Our sources today cover some pretty heavily charged geopolitical terrain.
Yeah, spanning from the Iran war and the military in Pakistan all the way to Wagner Group operations and Russian infrastructure maneuvers.
Exactly. So we just want to make it super clear, we're here strictly to impartially unpack the financial and economic analysis from these dispatches. We aren't endorsing any political viewpoints or, taking sides.
Right, we're just looking at how these specific events break the math that the global economy relies on.
Precisely. So to start us off, to understand how that math breaks, we kind of have to understand the baseline that the entire global market is currently treating as gospel, right?
Yeah, you have to look at the baseline, and that baseline is the IMF Article 4.
Okay, break that down for us.
So it is essentially a country's ultimate macroeconomic health check and roadmap. The International Monetary Fund goes in, they assess a nation's economy, and they project its future debt and growth trajectory.
Based on historical stability, mostly.
It's exactly based on historical stability. They run these really complex matrices, assigning probabilities to potential risks. Maybe a commodity price spike here or a localized geopolitical tension there.
And then they offer mitigation strategies for those specific things.
Right. But the fatal flaw baked into those models is the assumption that risks will behave politely.
Politely. I like that word for it.
Yeah. The model assumes a country will face one major structural shock at a time. It assumes the hurricane passes before the earthquake hits.
Which brings us to the core thesis of the dispatch we're looking at today. It asks a pretty terrifying question, honestly. What happens when those shocks do not queue up politely?
When they hit on the exact same Tuesday.
Right. What happens when two massive, completely independent crises arrive on the exact same day? The argument here is that markets are vastly mispricing global sovereign risk right now.
Because their navigation systems are functionally blind to simultaneous compounding crises?
It's wild.
It really is, because it fundamentally breaks the concept of available policy space. And honestly, there is no clearer, more immediate example of this architectural failure than what is happening in India right now.
Yeah, let's talk about India because the consensus view has long treated India as the structural anchor of its region.
Very much so. The IMF's November 2025 Article 4 for India projected a very manageable current account deficit. It was about 1.9% of GDP.
Which is solid.
Very solid. Assuming the country would comfortably accumulate foreign reserves up to around $650 billion. That was the blueprint.
But that blueprint relied on energy price paths and monsoon behavior that have both just completely evaporated.
Yeah, the ground-level reality detail of the dispatch is, frankly, jarring.
The Iran war has effectively destroyed regional LPG supplies, right?
Yes. And this isn't just a blip on a Bloomberg terminal. The sources detail how Indian households are panic buying induction cooking plates.
Wow.
And chai vendors across South India are literally padlocking their stalls.
Wait, really? Because of fuel costs?
Exactly. The fuel cost has just wiped out their margins entirely. So this is a structural rationing event.
But wait, it doesn't stop there. On top of that massive energy shock, they've just been hit with a severely downgraded monsoon forecast.
Right, which is the textbook definition of the compound shock we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You have an external commodity crisis crashing directly into a domestic agricultural crisis.
It's like your car engine blowing up and your roof caving in on the exact same afternoon.
That's a great way to put it.
Your emergency fund was designed for, one of those disasters, not both. But pushing back a little here, doesn't the Reserve Bank of India have tools to fix this? The IMF always recommends using, quote, available fiscal and monetary space.
They do recommend that, yes.
Yeah.
But here's why the RBI is trapped. The IMF's matrix modeled these kinds of events independently.
Okay.
If you have a weak monsoon, which drives up domestic food inflation, the central bank would typically need to step in and ease monetary policy, right? While the government uses fiscal space to support the agricultural sector.
But they can't do that if they're also fighting an energy crisis.
Exactly. It's a zero-sum trap.
So they either let their people starve by protecting the currency, or they let their currency collapse by trying to feed their people.
Precisely. The model didn't fail to predict the weather. It failed to realize that fixing the weather would bankrupt the central bank.
Because if the Reserve Bank tries to defend the rupee against the massive outflow of cash needed to buy suddenly expensive energy, they have to burn through those foreign reserves.
Right. And if they don't defend the currency, the rupee plummets, making the imported LPG even more ruinously expensive.
So defending the currency tightens liquidity.
Which is the exact opposite of what you need to do to support an agricultural sector suffering through a failed monsoon. Doing both simultaneously degrades both transmission channels.
Wow, okay, I see.
This is what the dispatch means by the compound ledger. A ledger does not care whether the monsoon failed first or the LPG supply vanished first.
It only cares about the total sum.
Exactly. And the sum of that energy bill combined with that harvest collapse creates a massive deficit trajectory that simply has not been repriced by the market yet.
Investors are still trading on the ghost of that 1.9% deficit projection.
Yep, they are entirely blind to it.
Which provides a really fascinating conceptual bridge, actually, because if India is a case of the market stubbornly ignoring a mathematical breakdown, well, the situation 1,800 kilometers to the west is a case of the market actively distracting itself with a shiny object.
Ah, yes, Pakistan.
Exactly. Let's look at Pakistan, where the market entered the week pricing the sovereign debt incredibly positively based entirely on a geopolitical headline.
It's a classic misreading of diplomatic signaling versus actual liquidity.
Right, because the market is rallying because General Asim Munir, who the dispatch describes as a fatigue-wearing strongman, is currently acting as a high-profile mediator between Washington and Tehran.
And from a behavioral finance perspective, investors see a country inserting itself into a critical diplomatic choke point, and they assign a sort of strategic premium to that country's debt.
The assumption being that geopolitical relevance naturally translates into hard financial support.
Right.
It feels like someone getting a fancy new diplomatic title at work, but the market is ignoring that their actual bank account is still deeply overdrawn. But, I mean, why is the market getting this wrong? Surely being a critical geopolitical mediator brings real financial support? No.
That is the exact trap the dispatch warns about. It draws a hard, bright line between geopolitical optionality and balance of payments financing.
Okay, explain the difference there.
Geopolitical optionality just means you have a seat at the table. It means Washington or Beijing will take your phone calls because you are useful in a specific temporary context.
Right.
But balance of payments financing is hard, liquid cash sitting in your central bank to ensure you can actually service your sovereign debt.
And Pakistan's financial architecture is heavily reliant on bilateral creditor rollovers, right? Specifically, their IMF Extended Fund facility.
Exactly. They need Saudi Arabia and the UAE to keep rolling over massive deposits just to stay afloat.
And the specific data point in the dispatch just totally shatters that illusion of safety.
The UAE repayment.
Yeah. Before General Munir even stepped into this mediation role, the UAE actually requested a $3.5 billion repayment.
That isn't a minor administrative adjustment. That is a blaring siren of structural strain.
Because a sovereign rollover isn't an automated process.
No, not at all. It requires deep, sustained political alignment. When a bilateral creditor demands capital back, it exposes the fragility of the entire debt maturity wall.
So the binding constraints on Islamabad right now are not about how useful they are in diplomatic back channels.
No, the constraints are their impending maturity wall and their bilateral creditor rollover schedules.
But the market is pricing in a mediator premium that is completely fiscally irrelevant.
Exactly. They're getting distracted by the shiny object while the deposit architecture weakens.
Okay, so we have markets misinterpreting positive noise in Pakistan and ignoring loud compounding shocks in India.
Right.
Now let's explore what happens when markets are completely blind to slowly accumulating silent negative signals.
This is where we look at Indonesia and the West African Sahel.
Yeah, the mechanics of what is happening in Jakarta right now are incredibly revealing.
Indonesia is the perfect case study for how structural baseline models fail to capture compounding governance and geopolitical decay.
Because the IMF wrote their investment-grade trajectory language for Indonesia well before a recent trio of highly concerning events occurred.
Exactly.
So the dispatch outlines three distinct downward vectors. First, MSCI delayed its frontier downgrade review.
Yep.
Second, an acid attack heavily implicating the military under the Purbo administration.
Right.
And third, a Taiwan Strait geopolitical re-rating using what the dispatch calls the Hormuz template.
Now, if you're an investor relying on an outdated baseline, you might look at those as three isolated, manageable headlines.
Just normal news cycle stuff.
Exactly. But when you actually unpack the mechanics of how those three events interact, they form a massive, unpriced downside scenario.
Okay, let's start with the MSCI downgrade delay.
Right, so this isn't just an administrative footnote. When a major index provider signals a potential downgrade, it fundamentally alters the flow of passive capital.
Because institutional funds that are mandated to hold certain tiers of sovereign debt are forced to begin modeling an exit.
Mechanically forces it, yes. It forces passive capital outflows right as active capital is getting spooked.
And what is spooking that active capital? The acid attack involving the military.
Exactly. Because this isn't just a localized crime story. It is a profound signal regarding institutional governance.
Right. When military impunity flares up, it triggers environmental, social, and governance covenants, ESG covenants, and institutional debt.
It raises the risk premium for foreign direct investment because the rule of law suddenly looks really fragile.
Yeah, makes total sense.
And then you layer on the third vector, the Hormuz template.
Okay, what exactly is the Hormuz template?
It's the realization, rippling through maritime logistics, that the Strait of Malacca and the Taiwan Strait could be instantly militarized and restricted.
Much like the Strait of Hormuz or the Red Sea.
Exactly. If global logistics suddenly have to price in the extreme vulnerability of Southeast Asian maritime choke points, it completely alters the discount rate for Indonesian exports.
So let me get this straight. You have passive index capital eyeing the exits, active institutional capital terrified by governance backsliding, and the fundamental supply chain geography being repriced for military risks.
All happening at once.
And the current spread on Indonesian sovereign credit simply does not compensate an investor for that combined three-pronged assault.
Not even close. The IMF model didn't update to reflect these new realities, so the market didn't update. It's a really dangerous lag.
And we see an entirely different but equally dangerous contagion mechanism playing out in West Africa.
Oh, absolutely. The Sahel presents a masterclass in how localized security failures cascade into regional financial crises.
The sources detail coordinated jihadist and secessionist attacks against Mali's military government, which, as we know, is currently backed by the Russian Wagner Group.
Right. And if you are just skimming the news, you probably file that under localized regional security.
Yeah, you might think, well, that's terrible for Mali, but why would a bondholder in an entirely different country, like Senegal or the Ivory Coast, care about a firefight in Bamako?
And that blindness to accumulating risk is the problem. It isn't just about domestic policies. It extends to how markets misjudge regional security architectures.
So what is the mechanism connecting them?
It's the West African Economic and Monetary Union, or WAEMU. When a country like Ivory Coast issues a Eurobond, the yield investors accept is heavily influenced by an implicit regional stability premium.
Oh, interesting. So Ivory Coast acts as the de facto anchor credit for the bloc.
Exactly. Investors accept a lower return because they are buying into the assumption that the broader neighborhood is relatively secure and economically integrated.
But the attacks in Mali are the earliest visible signal that the Wagner Group's security guarantee model in the Sahel is fundamentally failing.
And that failure isn't contained to Mali's borders. It fractures the regional stability premium that those neighboring Eurobonds are built on.
Right, it opens up multiple contagion pathways.
The IMF's own regional economic outlook explicitly identifies Sahel's security deterioration as a material risk to the DVEMU zone's overall fiscal trajectory.
Because when the security umbrella erodes, border trade plummets.
And defense spending across the entire currency bloc has to surge.
Which cannibalizes funds that were supposed to go toward infrastructure or debt servicing.
Exactly.
Not to mention the remittance channels. The diaspora money flowing back into these neighboring credits from cross-border workers is suddenly at risk when the regional anchor starts to fray.
Yep. The contagion pathway to a spread widening in Abidjan and Dakar might not happen overnight, but the dispatch is explicitly warning that the pathway is now wide open.
The foundation is cracking, even if the building hasn't tilted yet.
Which brings us to the most severe analytical failure detailed in the dispatch.
Oh, Kazakhstan.
Yes. We've talked about markets missing compounding shocks, getting distracted by geopolitical theater, and ignoring accumulating regional risks.
But Kazakhstan is an example of what happens when the market completely misclassifies the core nature of a threat altogether.
It really is. The situation in Astana is stark,
Russia has suspended Kazakh oil flows through the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, the CPC.
which is the absolute main artery for Kazakhstan of hydrocarbon exports heading west.
And the dispatch notes that the global market is basically shrugging this off. They're reading it as a Berlin heating fuel problem, essentially treating it like a seasonal European energy annoyance.
Which is crazy. Treating the CPC pipeline closure like a seasonal European heating issue is like diagnosing a severed carotid artery as a minor paper cut, just because both involve a little bleeding.
Wow.
It is a total misclassification of a terminal shock to the country's entire revenue stream.
Okay, let's pull apart the mechanics of the IMF's Kazakhstan Article 4 to see exactly why this is so catastrophic.
Sure.
The IMF's baseline for Kazakhstan relies heavily on the national fund.
Right, the sovereign wealth buffer.
Yeah, it's essentially designed to absorb commodity price volatility.
Yeah.
Like if the global price of oil is budgeted at $60 a barrel and it spikes to 80, the extra $20 flows into the national fund.
And if the price drops to 40, the fund pays out the difference to stabilize the national budget. It is a brilliant insurance policy for price swings.
But the suspension of the CPC pipeline by Russia is not a price risk.
No, it is a pure volume risk.
The oil isn't suddenly cheaper on the global market. It simply cannot physically leave the country.
Exactly. You can have oil pricing at $100 a barrel, but if your export volume drops to absolute zero, the revenue is zero.
And the arithmetic of the IMF's debt sustainability analysis, the DSA, completely falls apart when volume hits zero.
Right, because the National Fund's drawdown rules were never calibrated to replace a total loss of pipeline access.
Debt servicing requires actual dollar inflows from ongoing exports, not just a static pool of reserve capital that is rapidly draining.
Exactly. And the nature of the suspension is crucial here.
Because it wasn't an engineering failure or a natural disaster.
No. This restriction was explicitly initiated by a sovereign counterparty, Russia, demonstrating a clear willingness to weaponize infrastructure access for geopolitical leverage.
So the insurance policy was written for a market fluctuation, but the reality is a geopolitical blockade.
And the bondholder is going to be left holding the bag for this misclassification.
Because if you price a structural revenue interruption as if it were just a temporary seasonal price dip, you are completely blind to the reality that the medium-term trajectory for Astana has been fundamentally invalidated.
The creditor relationship with Russia has changed, the stability assumptions are gone, and the structural baseline is essentially fiction.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the compound ledger.
The ledger does not care about the intent of the IMF's original model. It only tallies the actual realities on the ground.
Well, we have covered an immense amount of ground today.
We really have.
From the zero-sum trap of India's central bank fighting simultaneous monsoon and energy shocks to the illusion of Pakistan's geopolitical mediation premium.
Yep.
We've tracked how an acid attack in Jakarta and a Wagner Group failure in Mali quietly erode the foundations of institutional debt. And we've seen how weaponizing a pipeline in Kazakhstan breaks the very math of sovereign debt sustainability.
It all comes back to the baseline.
Exactly. So if there is a single unified takeaway from this dispatch for you, the listener, it is this: economic models and baseline projections are not a crystal ball.
No, they're not.
They're merely fragile assumptions that the stability of the past will politely extend into the future.
Which it rarely does.
Right. So whether you are managing global sovereign debt, running a multinational supply chain, or just building your own financial portfolio, assuming that crises will queue up one at a time is a guaranteed path to ruin.
The monsoon doesn't check to see if the LPG crisis is finished before it fails.
The compound ledger only cares about the total sum.
Which leaves you with a final thought to mull over as you navigate this interconnected world.
Oh, this is a good one.
If the premier macroeconomic models governing sovereign debt, models built by armies of PhDs at the IMF, are this profoundly blind to simultaneous compound shocks, how fragile are the automated systems we rely on every day?
That is terrifying to think about.
Right. Think about the algorithms governing corporate algorithmic trading, or the automated risk assessment bots managing institutional portfolios. They're all drinking from the exact same flawed, structurally polite baseline assumptions.
So if a Russian pipeline closure And a failed Indian monsoon can silently break the IMF's most sophisticated math. What exactly happens to the millions of automated trading bots when the next compound crisis hits without warning?
Or are we hurtling into the next decade with financial navigation systems that are functionally blind to how modern reality actually operates?
When the structural blueprint insists the skyscraper is fine, but you can feel the floor shaking from the earthquake and hear the windows shattering from the hurricane. Well, it is time to stop trusting the schematic and start looking at the walls.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the consensus, always look for the compound sum, and we will catch you next time.